in a previous video, I was talking about how you can have type safety using fetch when you're fetching data, either using Supabase or something else in Nuxt. And so how you can actually have type safety traverse all the way throughout your components. Pretty cool stuff. But then how about having type safety from the user to the server? And so we'll see that we can achieve almost a bit of type safety, or at least put validations in terms of type safety, either for a post request, a get request, making sure that what your user sends to the server is actually valid data, and that there is no malicious intent when you want to fetch too much data or not enough data, or just making sure that whatever data arrives in the server is going to be valid. So here we have a very simple example of an application where we could assume that this would be like a form input for a user where you have an email. And so we want to make sure that we're validating. Of course, you can validate on the client. That's one thing, but you also want to validate on in the server as well. So best of both worlds is you do both. And so here we're not going to validate on the client. We're going to see how we can validate on the server. Most probably you'll want to do both, making sure that the user has some feedback, but don't just rely on feedback on validation on the clients directly. So if I just type in something that is not valid, I'm going to have an actual response. And if we go into the network, take a look at this here. If I do this again, I'm going to get a 400 error. And so essentially what's happening here, if I'm able to expand this, is that there is a validation error, and that we can see it here, validation error. So I'm not having anything in the response, but I'm getting a validation error. And if I put an actual valid email, or at least the email is valid in terms of its format, I get the body is valid, email johndoe@gmail.com. So let's actually take a look at what's happening under the hood. Is if we go into our index.post.ts, we're using Zod, the kind of format validator here. And we're using this, instead of just reading the body as we could be doing, right? We could be doing this array read body, and that would be, that could be okay. But then what happens here is that if we just do this, our body has an any structure, which is not ideal, right? So we want to make sure that we're actually validating the body. So here what we're doing is using read validated body. And so what we're passing the body through is an actual schema. And so here what we can see is that we're actually using the event, and then we're passing the body through something. We're returning this. So we're saying, hey, does the body equal this object here? So this object has an email, and then we're using Zod's ability to actually validate if that string is an actual email. And then we parse the body. And as a result, our body is, first of all, type safe. And then if there's an error, as you saw in the example, we get a validation error. Now we could use safe parse to not have to maybe return an actual error if you want to actually say, hey, I want to provide some feedback to the end user of what's happening and what is wrong with the data. But most realistically, what you would have is in the server, you might have some just some validations that actually just throws an error right away, and have on the client a message saying, hey, this email was not okay. And realistically, what would happen is that you would actually do the validation on the client, and if the client didn't pass the validation, then you would just not even send the request to the server. But that could be valid, like if you want to actually make sure that the email is not already taken or something, you could do the validation as well on the client to get some feedback, but you might also want to do it on the server. So that's one way to do it using post requests. Let's actually take a look at also a get request here. So our get request, we've got some data that I can get, and I have a page count that I can set here. So the user can set the page count. And so we're saying here max is 30. So if I get the data here, I've got some data returns. I've got 20 items. Those are airport names. So what happens if I want to put, for example, 35, I'm going to get an error as well. And if we go into the network again here, get the data again, I'm getting a validation error. So here we're not, this time it's actually the query that we're actually validating in the gets. Status 400. So here, if I go into my index.get.ts, we can ignore the data here. And we're doing this same thing here, where we're using get validated query, and it's the same principle here. We're actually making sure that, I don't need this async, we're actually making sure that the query adheres to this object here. So we have page counts. We're saying this needs to be a number. Coerce means that what is being passed into the query might be a string. So it's just saying, like, if you see a string, try to understand it as a number. And if it doesn't work, then you throw an error. And then we say that you cannot request something that is negative, like a page count that is negative, or 0. So you need to at least have 1, or if you put 0 here, I'm going to get a validation error. And the maximum is 30 if we want to make sure that no user is actually fetching too much data in one go. So we're saying max 30. And we can provide a message as well. So this would be in the case where you want to actually display the message to the end user. You wouldn't want to use parse in this case. You would want to use safe parse and actually return and gets the error that is being returned, and maybe make it part of the response that you have from your for your users. And so here I'm just returning the data that is hard coded here. So this could be something that where you have a call to a database, something like this, where you want to actually provide the page count to this database, and this would work as well. In our applications, we're using this with a search filter. We could use this with the page number. So I want to be on page 2. You can really do this with anything in your query to make sure that your query that is being returned is valid in this case. And then our last use case is going to be getting the record of a specific thing. So for example, here let's say I've got records which have UUIDs. And so here we can't really see this, but currently my page is get UUID slash 876. And so this is not a valid UUID. So if we look at our page here, UUID.view, we're actually fetching the API slash endpoint slash UUID. This actually needs to be, this is actually wrong. I'm gonna need to rename this. Actually, it's okay. UID, and then we're actually doing this UID. And so we're actually fetching this UID, get UID, and then we're displaying the data and the error if there is an error. And so the beautiful thing about this, if we go into our endpoint UID index.get.ts, we're using the get validated router params. So this is part of the parameters. So we saw the body, we saw the query, and then now we see the actual parameters that are being passed in. And so that's what we're seeing here. We're saying, hey, the parameters should be something where you have a UID, which corresponds to that UID slug here in the folder. So that's the route of your of the API endpoint, and we're making sure that this is a string and that it's a UUID, and then we're parsing the parameters. So as a result, the parameters are going to be type safe with a UUID. And so what happens here is if I try to type in a wrong UID with the wrong formats, I'm getting this error here. So if I try with 123, for example, error gets API endpoint slash 123. In reality, what you would probably want to do is also do a navigation guard on this page so that you can't just pass in a wrong UID. But I wanted to show you what happens in the server if you try to, because you can guard the page, in one go, but you also want to make sure that your server is also protected in this case. So if I put an actual valid UID, which I have here, a random one, I'm going to have this UID is a valid UID that passes the validation. So that returns the value in my endpoint. So there you go. We saw how to validate, make sure that you validate in the server a body. So here in our example, a post in our body post. We also saw how to validate, make sure that you can validate a query with get validated query. And then we also saw how to do that with parameters. So we really recommend that you use this. It's always good to have type safety. Unfortunately, for now, there's not, we're not able to actually get type safety when you're passing the query specifically. So for example, when you're doing, ideally what I want to do is in my post, I'd like to have auto completion or making sure that the body here, is actually type safe and doesn't let me have, any other field. Because right now it actually can do that. It doesn't really care for it, but that might arrive in a later version. And yeah, Type safety is pretty cool. So if you have any questions, let me know, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks. Bye.